Good afternoon, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to our InTalks webinar on cybersecurity and cyber resilience framework. They say data is the new oil, right? But without proper cybersecurity, it is like storing oil in paper cups. Our mission today is to ensure that we upgrade those paper cups into safe vaults and also ensure that they are leak-proof and resilient. As I can see, we have a diverse audience for today's webinar, and for some, it may be a completely new topic. So let me set the foundation. In simple words, this cybersecurity and cyber resilience framework is a set of rules and practices which is going to help the organizations defend against the cyber attacks. Not only defending against the cyber attack, it is also the framework also envisages that ensure that they recover quickly once they get hit by a cyber attack. And SEBI has listed specific entities who have to follow and adhere to this framework. And the latest framework released by SEBI in August 2024, it is not just a regulatory requirement, right? It is also about building trust and the confidence, especially with the foreign institutional investors, FPIs, and obviously for the domestic investors. Before we dive further into the webinar, so let me quickly introduce myself. I am Rahul Vasudev, a chartered accountant, and I also hold certifications in Information Systems Audit and Certified Forensic Auditor. Recently, I completed a course on Artificial Intelligence Strategy from the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. Currently, I lead the Virtual CFO and Accounting Outsource Division at Incorp India. On a personal note, I am a sports enthusiast and a trekker. I have had the privilege of completing a couple of high-altitude Himalayan treks, and these treks have not only tested my endurance, but also taught me the value of resilience. And the lesson which is absolutely relevant for today's topic of cybersecurity and resilience. And this is a hot topic, right? This slide appropriately highlights the global threat landscape that we have today. As we can see from these headlines, cyber threats are no longer just a technical issue. They have become a major risk to the global infrastructure, the financial market, and individual organizations. As you can see, one of the headline which read Nikhil Kamath of Zerodha, he is of the opinion that the biggest challenge to this, the cybersecurity is the biggest challenge to mutual funds. And this is a sentiment that resonates across industry. And the next headline, which read that more than 2,700 complaints of cyber financial fraud in just a single year. And these examples shows that it is no longer a question of, if, but, when, etc. An organization will face cyber attack, either it is today or tomorrow. And the real question is, are we prepared? Are we prepared to withstand and recover from such events? Let me set the stage, and briefly introduce the topic for our audience. In today's hyper-connected world, cyber threats have emerged as one of the most critical risks to our financial system, like I already mentioned. We rely so much on digital technologies, and similarly, the securities market also significantly utilizes the technology and stuff. And they hence have become the prime target for these cyber attacks. Whenever there is a cyber attack, it will lead to financial losses, the disruptions, data breaches, and most importantly, there is a loss of confidence among the investors. This framework emphasizes the importance of being proactive from a governance and risk assessment to the detection, response, and recovery. It is about building systems that not only defend against these attacks, like I mentioned, it is also how you recover and evolve whenever you face an adversity like this. In one of the recent conferences that I attended, someone was mentioning, right in the side talks, in today's digital world, there are only two types of companies. Ones that they have already been hacked, and the others who don't know that they have already been hacked. So the hacking of a company has become like a given. SEBI's framework is designed to ensure that we don't fall into either of these two categories that I just mentioned. Now it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, my dear friend Narasimhan Elangovan. We fondly call him Nara. He is a true thought leader in GRC and is a pioneer in integrating technologies and in professional practices. Nara is a partner in Ken & Co Chartered Accountants and a renowned keynote speaker and has authored many books on information systems, data analytics, cybersecurity, and privacy laws. He specializes in risk-based audits, privacy impact assessment, SOC audits, advisory in AI, blockchain, and the emerging new technologies of cloud computing, etc. Beyond his professional achievements, Nara has trained over 25,000 professionals and students, and he is a certified information system auditor and was ranked among the top 20% of the world when he cleared the CISA exam. He was also named as one of the top 10 influential consulting leaders 2020 by CEO Insights and has won the Cloud Champion Award in December 2023. Nara, a hearty welcome to our InTalks webinar.
Thank you so much, Rahul. Indeed, a pleasure to meet you and be a part of this conversation. Looking forward to our interaction.
Thank you. So let us begin the core of the webinar now. So this webinar is going to be in a Q&A format. We have compiled about 8 to 10 questions based on our discussions with the professionals in the industry, experts, our colleagues, etc. So let me begin with the first question, Nara. So SEBI has been enhancing the cybersecurity awareness and from many years, right? And how is the new cybersecurity and resilience framework that they are now calling it, which was released in August 2020, how is it different from the earlier frameworks or the guidelines that we had?
Okay. Thanks, Rahul, for bringing up this question, because every time a new regulation comes, everybody's question is, what is so new in this? Was it not there in the old, right? So that's generally the thought process. So the first thing which I have to probably say from a 2018, and I don't exactly mean 2018 because 2018 is when the first framework came in. On a graded basis, subsequently other frameworks also did appear. The first thing, if you look into it, right, the scope, if you ask me, was predominantly a handful of players. It is obviously the largest amongst whom we can imagine, right? The stock exchange, because that's where the literal trade settlement happens. And imagine a cyber attack, or even for a few seconds, their system being down, right? Volumes of trade are going to be impacted. And obviously, people are going to have losses, etc. So the first was obviously for stock exchange and the entire related large players. It could be depository participants or maybe the mutual funds, etc. But the 2024 guideline has brought almost every security market intermediary into the ambit. I'm talking about brokers, I'm talking about credit rating agency, I'm talking about AIFs, your VC funds, right? So earlier you thought VC funds were investing in cybersecurity companies for their startups or valuation XYZ. Now the VC fund itself has to ensure that they are adhering to the cybersecurity framework, right? So that's a very interesting thing. Second biggest change is the concept of resilience. Earlier, it focused maybe on cybersecurity protocols and limited extent to this resilience. Now it has come up with resilience as a key pillar, and it is said, how do you anticipate issues? How do you probably withstand? An example could be, how are you monitoring your network traffic? Are you having a real-time SOC and knock? And SOC and knock in layman's language is monitoring the incoming and outgoing traffic which is coming onto your servers to see if any malicious payload comes in with a huge possible attack, right? So am I having some sort of requirements or flexibility of monitoring that? And that is where resilience comes into picture. And the third, which I really, really like and appreciate, for the first time, they have understood that I cannot hold a framework applicable for everybody because this is like a uniformed framework. Right? We keep on hearing on uniform code of law, uniform code of various things. This is a uniform code for all the regulated entities, beg your pardon, which means I cannot make everything applicable for a stockbroker who just has probably 1,000 customers vis-a-vis a stock exchange who's doing $1 billion settlement. So they have done what is called as a graded approach, and I'll speak more about the graded approach a little later. where they have said not everything is applicable for everybody. And I really like that, right? Of course, it's a little bit of a challenge to figure out what is applicable and what is not applicable. Maybe the world of AI will probably give us some answers. But yes, that is the third interesting thing. The fourth will I probably go into, as I said, the traditional methods focus on vulnerability penetration testing or maybe some basic firewall, right? Whereas here they've gone to the extent of having a SOC and a NOC, which I said, right? Assessing the effectiveness of those. And whether we like it or not, mandatory audits are there, which is going to be a job for you and me. But yes, we're going to have mandatory audits. And they've also insisted that ISO 27001 certification, certain things like a red teaming exercise, reporting framework standardization, periodicity of reporting, all of these are enhanced. I think the whole objective is to bring that additional sort of protocols so that organizations, market intermediaries are better equipped. Hopefully that gives, I know it's a long answer, but that's what the framework is. And hopefully I've answered your question in giving perspective of what is the difference between the 18 versus 24.
Understood. Understood. So in short, earlier it was mainly the cyber security, and the new framework places equal weightage, if not more, on the resilience also, and obviously expanding the scope to the other entities that are there.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Next, moving on, can you throw some light on the key objectives and goals of this framework?
Okay. Now, like any other framework starts off, right? You have a core reason why somebody wants to introduce a legislation or a regulation. The more often and not, the most common reason would obviously be to enhance cybersecurity measures, right? So make it more robust. See, unless you have a code of law, somebody can simply say, I have an antivirus software and therefore I'm cybersecurity compliant, right? But it might be a very small thing, and people might say that small thing is sufficient. While I'm not under determining the need of an antivirus software, but there are much more larger threats. A simplest example is people do not think backup as a requirement. Because when unfortunately an attack like a ransomware hits you hard, the challenge is you're actually losing the data. And what do you do to get back the data? Obviously, it is not practical for you to pay the ransom, right? Your backups are going to save you. And people, what happened was people followed the strategy and then people started taking backup. The fraudsters became even more smarter. They said, okay, you're not going to pay me the ransom. I will leak out whatever data I have collected from you, right? Because you're not going to pay me, right? No problem because you have a backup. Let me take this data and start leaking out. Now that is where the real threat is. Then people matured and said, hey, I should not only take a backup, I should ensure the backup is encrypted. Right now, this is where the exact concept of this objectives comes into picture, right? On one side, you want to enhance the cybersecurity measures. On the other side, ensure you have a resilient framework, right? And in fact, the chart below speaks about resilience. I'll come to it in a minute from now, right? See if you're able to standardize cybersecurity practices across the industry, bring in a risk management element, right? Bring in, we keep on talking about financial risk, internal financial control risk, but have we spoken about cyber risk management, right? Are we doing a periodical risk assessment? That's where it comes into. And not just that, you need to do regular assessments. And we'll speak about it as we go along. It could be as simple as doing an update, or every time a new software or a patch is updated, you may have to do probably a penetration testing, right? Or something which is substantially has undergone a change, you may have to do certain things. One thing which is also you need to keep in mind, this is also in line with the Indian Cyber Emergency Response Team's guidelines, what we call it as CERT cert, right? Now they're also strengthening on the incident reporting, because unless you report an incident, people are not aware of what has happened, and those who are impacted will never be knowing that such a thing has taken place, right? And maybe by reporting incident, others could also quickly become aware of it, spread the awareness that, hey, this sort of a financial industry is having this impact. I think it makes a lot of sense for me to probably touch base with some other departments and industries, right? So that is also another interesting thing. And last is to make sure you're compliant on the ongoing basis. It could be cybersecurity framework, it could be something from a global perspective, etc. But just adding another flavor into it, right? If you remember, I told you, Rahul, this is both cyber security and cyber resilience.
Resilience.
So if you see the framework below, and this is something which I've extracted, of course, slightly done a different animation to give that right perspective, right? What they've told us, they have come up for the first time with 5 resilience goals, and that 5 goals, they have mapped it with a cybersecurity function. This is very unique in thought process. So first I come up with what is my resilient goal. And they said the resilient goal called as evolve is spread across. It is not just from 1, 2, and 3, right? They need to spread it across, which is a smart thing to do, right? And you will find that here, if those of you are looking into the math, I can see evolve, anticipate, and recover, whereas the fourth is both withstand and fifth is contain. They've clubbed it together, and the mapping also comes on those lines. We will not go into too much of those details because this is an overview session, right? So the evolve function is probably pervasive, spread across all the phases. Then you have anticipate, withstand, and recover. This is 5 things acts as a resilience goal. Now, each of this resilient goal is mapped to a cybersecurity function. Now, why the cybersecurity function becomes very important is larger the organization gets, each of this function is with a different stakeholder. To give an example, let's say, for example, an organization like Incorp or Ken & Co, right? Maybe because of the size and scale we are, right? You might probably have maybe a handful, 1 or 2 people to take care of the overall IT, right? Now imagine the companies like of Ind Money, Zerodha, or whoever it is, right? The modern brokerage. Now they would obviously have a larger cybersecurity team, and bear in mind you have a larger IT team as well. So how do I bifurcate these people's roles? That is where this role of a cybersecurity function comes in. The governance roles are those which are probably at the board, maybe at the CIO, the CISO, or the data protection officer. Those folks may probably address that. The identity bucket is more to do with how are you able to identify the threats, some amount of risk management. Is your SOC and NOC, if you remember, I told you, right? Are they working robust enough? And then you have the protect element. Now, these are the guys who are actually implementing the controls, right? It could be starting from encryption to monitoring of traffic, your firewall, whatever it is, right? And then it is not sufficient if you're able to protect. You need to have somebody to monitor, right? Are we able to have an early detection mechanism? And if I am able to detect, how am I able to respond? What is the targeted action? What is the next step? And last but not the least, even if something untoward happens, how am I able to recover and get started? Right? In fact, the last three, detect, respond, and recover, may come into situations only when something unfortunate has happened, at least as far as recover and respond is concerned. But it doesn't mean that I will let it go until that phase and say, hey, we are all there. Go ahead and work it out. No, I want to do that sort of a testing way beforehand, right? And
Need to
that's
be
where the entire
prepared.
framework has a unique advantage.
Exactly. So when you were mentioning about the cyber attacks and asking for a ransom and stuff, like, it just flashed my mind. It's not only the big corporations, right? Even chartered accountant firms in Bangalore and Hyderabad, they've had these cyber attacks, and the fraudsters asking for a ransom in cryptocurrency
Ransom.
rather. So Narsimhan will remember
Absolutely.
these
Absolutely.
cases.
Yes. Yes.
And the whole focus is on identify, detect, protect, respond, recover, so that it completes the entire
Entire
circle.
cycle.
Yes, entire circle. Thank you. So now that we have spoken about the risks and the stuff, can you let us know the applicability to which entities is this framework applicable, and are there any exclusions to this rule?
Okay. So I'll probably start on a slightly on a lighter side. This framework is 210 odd pages, right? So the moment I say something which is 210 of pages and which has some bit of technical literature, and going to say it is applicable, everybody is going to be worried whether it's going to be applicable for me or not as an organization. And that's where, we have this, which I've brought in as a small slide, which you can see over here. Yeah, where you can see that literally it is applicable for every possible security market intermediary. Let me be very, very clear, right? Starting from AIF, which is your your venture capital funds, right? Then you have bankers to an issue. Of course, these are bankers. Generally, the RBI guidelines is there, and this is also additionally they have to comply with. You have your clearing corporations, which is focused on clearing, settlement, etc. You have a collective investment scheme. Hardly any person has registered in India. Maybe some producer companies have registered that. Credit rating agencies, your CRISIL, ICRA, all of those entities. custodians who hold in custody various assets, debenture trustees, depositories, which is your NSDL, CDSL, depository participants. These are basically those players who have a license to have a demat account or open a demat account, right? Deposits who are, designated depository as well as through depositories who overwork. Then you have investment advisors. Now you can have a proprietary concern who's advising, or an individual who has a SEBI license and he is advising to his customers which stock to purchase, and this based on certain terms. Even that individual will have to register and or will have to follow these regulations. That is where it becomes completely applicable for a large range of players. And then we have your merchant banking entities, the bigger players, the mutual fund and the asset management company, right? The portfolio managers who are managing your PMS. And just to bring in context, PMS are those where more than 50 lakh rupees of ticket size, they sort of manage your portfolio on your behalf. And of course, you have discretionary and non-discretionary. Most of them go for a discretionary, where funds are pumped in by HNIs and other individuals, right? Where it is sort of managed, right? Then you also have registrar and share transfer agent, who's responsible when there is person when there is a death, or even in case of a regular transmission, or as a matter of fact, general transfers. Stock brokers, stock exchange, and venture capital, right? So by all possibilities, it applies to literally every market intermediary. But then the next question, Rahul, you would obviously ask is, you told that Nara, you told me that, investment advisor with one person was a stock exchange with probably managing a billion worth of transactions. Is it going to be different? That is where this graded approach comes. And I am a big fan of this particular thing. The reason is they have made it applicable based on the volume, size, and risk. First thing, they've categorized what is called as market institutions, right? Market infrastructure institutions. These are typically your stock exchanges, your depositories, who are probably driving or running the entire market, right? So these are called as market infrastructure institutions, right? So these are typically, and for them, literally the entire guideline is applicable. There could be very minuscule set of things which is not applicable. The reason is because there might be some smaller provisions which is applicable to the extreme right, which you see, which is self-certification RE, right? So literally the entire 200 odd page guideline is applicable for these folks. Then comes a major player, right? For whom I would say maybe about 80 to 90% is applicable. And these are qualified regulated entities, right? Now, this is the second bucket of the players for whom maybe about 80, 90% odd is applicable. Then you have mid, small, and self-certification, who are probably smaller players. But then, Rahul, you should ask me with this interesting question, or I'm sure audience would have this question. Hey, we spoke of 5 graded approach, but in the previous slide, you said 19 different players. How do I marry both of them? And this is where it is very interesting. Of course, I don't have that slide or information, but I just thought I'll give you a perspective, right? If you go into the previous slide, Rahul, you will find something to do with AIF, if you recollect, right? And AIF, I made a mention that AIF is who? A person who's probably managing funds on,
Yes.
like a venture capitalist or anything on those lines, right? Now, if I look closely, now a venture capitalist, what is the basis on which I could decide he would fall under any of those 5 categories in the next slide, which you just saw, right? You saw 5 categories, right? Those 5 categories were um, your market institutions, you found registered REs, right? You found mid-size, small, and self-certification. Now the AIF entire thing is based on what? The fund they manage, the asset under management, the AUM, that's the popular word. So they say if any AIF is having more than 1,000 crores, they fall under qualified RE, right? Whereas on the extreme, if an AIF is probably less than 100 crores, they fall under self-certification RE, right? I hope you got that sort of a flavor. Now, given that for a simple AIF, there is a categorization, imagine for each of the players, how does it happen? An example, a stockbroker. If a stockbroker has more than 5 lakh active clients, he becomes a qualified RE, right? Maybe Rahul, you can just go to the next slide where you can see those buckets, right? You can see that qualified RE, a stockbroker. Remember, a stockbroker can never be a market infra institution, which I
Yes.
told you, it's only to do with your players like, let's say, your stock market, depository, etc. Right? So a qualified RE could be somebody who is maybe, in terms of a stockbroker, more than 5 lakh clients. Whereas 50,000 to 5 lakh would be a mid size, 10,000 to 50,000 is small size, and less than 10,000 is self-certification. I hope you got that sort of a flavor, right?
Yes,
Now, there
yes.
could be smaller players who is probably not dealing with so much of personal data and other information. For example, a collective investment scheme, and to a limited extent, a credit rating agency. They have been categorized as self-certification REs, right? So this is where comparing the previous slide in terms of the 19 odd entities versus these 5 odd buckets is very important, because once you map in one of those categories, that is when you start reading, okay, how is this applicable for me and what is the repercussion.
So
Now you
there
go
is a
to the
monetary
question, Rahul.
slab for applicability under each of
Yes.
these categories.
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
Okay.
yes. And in fact, that slab is too much of a literature, so it's not
Yeah,
worthy
yeah,
to
yeah. So
probably have
we'll
a
have to.
conversation. Happy to, offline discuss if the participants have some questions. But yes, that's where you can probably bridge both.
Yeah.
But
And
then you
this
could also ask me a
categorization
question.
and segregation into different buckets makes sense, right? Rather than imposing everything on everyone, that will
Absolutely.
make the life of smaller and medium enterprises, miserable for trying to
Miserable.
follow
Correct.
everything.
So you could say that, see, if I want something to be uniform, the only way I can probably make sure it is uniform literally is by understanding the challenges and the uniqueness of each of them. That's why like I said, for an AIF, the categorization is based on the AUM. On the
Correct.
contrary, for a stockbroker, it is based on your clients,
Client, number
right?
of
So
clients.
that's where that sort of a graded bifurcation is there, and you also have this visibility. But of course, if you go to the next slide, there are a bunch of small players for whom it is not applicable, right?
Hmm.
Probably, just to give you some insights, for whom it could not be applicable, we have a very small players like, for foreign portfolio investors,
Hmm.
individual investment advisors, where I made a mention, right? So there are some sort of exemptions which are given. Let's not go too much into it, but those are people where you've got some sense of, exemption.
Sure, sure. So now that we have understood the objective, the goal, and the applicability, can you elaborate on the timelines for adopting this framework?
Sure, sure. So from a timeline perspective, for any organization, and I'm talking about the August circular, for
Yes.
any organization where there was already an existing cybersecurity framework, January 1, 2025 was the timeline, which means we are already 15 days past, right? And who are these organizations for whom already regulations were applicable? If you go to SEBI's website and just filter for cybersecurity framework, you'll get a bunch of players. And those are players like your security market intermediaries, right? Then I spoke about, if you recollect, to some extent, market institutions,
Mhm.
depositories or depository participants, right? You had your AMCs, stock exchange players. So all these were basically how it was actually set up. But then what happened was, if you jump into the next slide after this, you will realize that there are some players where SEBI realized the practical challenge, right? Where it said that I may probably not be able to implement everything because August the framework came up and you expect me to do it by December 31st. It's a little bit of a too much of an overdose, right?
Mhm.
So what they said for the first time, they came up with an interesting word called regulatory forbearance,
Mhm.
which means, which means I am okay if you have not complied in full letter and spirit for a period of 3 months, probably a extended honeymoon period, as long as you're able to demonstrate to me some meaningful steps. And this is for all those entities or organizations where existing framework already is there. And those are the list which you can see there, right? Of course, just to give a context, registered intermediaries could be anybody, right? For registered intermediate, they came up with some small guidelines. It was not a detailed circular. It was not even a resilience framework. So, the interpretation could probably be, handy out there to look into it. But then you also need to remember for what happens next, right? So the next set of players for whom it is literally applicable from the 1st of April 2025 is everybody,
Mhm.
right? Literally everybody from 1st of April 2025 is applicable. So effectively, we have 2 months and 15 days in our hand with us, right, to make sure we are compliant. Now, you could obviously ask me what are the penalties and other things. We'll address that a little later. But yes, one small
Yeah.
amendment or clarification with the SEBI came up in December 2024. It said that the data localization requirement is put on hold. Just to bring in context, what is data localization? Rahul, I'm sure you must be using a
Yes.
Gmail or a personal ID, right? We know that Gmail servers are not there in India.
Correct.
We are, for all practical purpose, when we send an email, it is actually going to going as far as US, probably retrieving from the servers out there, and we are able to see that, right? The data localization says, because data, I don't want it to leave the country's borders. Tomorrow, if some untoward incident happens in this global play, right, at least if companies cut off the connections, I am in no way accessible with the data, right? But if I have it within my geographical boundaries, at least I have accessibility to that, right? And this also should be read in line with the data privacy proposed act, or rather the
Yeah.
act is already there, the proposed implementation timelines and rules, where they've given some sort of a forbearance, or rather, given a relaxation. So this particular point will evolve over in the next few months or probably a year. But yes, at this point, this is applicable from 1st of January with regulatory forbearance until March 31st. And for the rest of them, April 1st, 2025, you need to make sure you're compliant.
Understood. And as per your discussions in the industry and the professional circles, Nara, so do you think the organizations have taken some baby steps? Are they ready for
They have
adoption, or there
started,
are
but the problem
laggards?
is the framework is too huge. Let me be very, very honest.
Mhm.
200-page of document, getting that converted into a sort of a requirement list and doing that mapping, which is applicable to you, that itself is a time-consuming job. And in
Mhm.
fact, where I have done these sort of assessments and implementations, right, the challenge for me is to determine this by asking those appropriate questions and to identify what is applicable. With that, in that itself, it takes a good amount of, probably a 1 week's time. Once the base is set, then we go ahead with that, phase of gap assessment and other things. So yes, they are ready, but not fully ready. That could be that.
No, thank you. So, considering this revised, deferred date of 1st April 25, so how should the organizations, plan what should be their implementation steps to ensure that they comply with the requirements?
Good question, Rahul. Because everybody eventually will, after attending this webinar, you should have a take-home point, right? And I think the crux would come in the slide to come, which you can quickly present it, right? I have probably put it as 5 odd buckets. You can go ahead and finish that animation. PowerPoints are sometimes funny, right? So if you ask me, 5 broad things would be: first is to identify what is the framework applicable to you. In other words, you know that you want to wear a suit, or you want to wear a pajama, or you want to wear a kurta salwar kameez, right? But you need to get clear cut what is your specifications, pick and choose. That is what your requirement identification is, right? And that happens by analyzing the framework, your org structure, where you fit in, etc., and do that basic initial exercise. And this typically has taken, at least for me, about a week's time, because A is awareness and B is bringing them together. The moment this is done, the biggest of this exercise is gap assessment. Now you go through each of the compliance requirements and identify what is the gap. Remember, some of these compliance points have open interpretation. So that is where it's going to be a challenge. And those in the legal family would probably understand that interpretation is a very, very funny exercise, right? I could interpret it slightly in a different tone, right? So I need to take the intention of the law at the end of the day and be a little more cautious on that, right? So that's where the gap assessment comes into picture, and prioritize these risks. Now, I'll give you a simple example. If I've identified that I do not have something called as SBOM, software bill of material, which I'll speak about it in the slide to come, right? I'm just talking about approach. I'll talk about 5 or 6 very unique cases in the couple of slides later. So you need to define a process for that, right? Refer the certain website. They've spoken about the detailed SBOM guidelines. See how I have to follow that and implement it for me, right? So that's basically an requirement of a gap assessment. Once this gap assessment is done, you know what are your problems, you need to fix them, right? And you need to develop a framework or a policy and make sure that policy is put into place. Remember, a policy is a document. it has to be put into place, right? You need to have a tool for it. A simplest example is I need to have a centralized SCIM solution, which will monitor my network security. Do you have it? No, bring that into place, right? So identify solutions, tools, vendors, collaborate. If you have to get some certifications, very interesting. And let me remind you, some of these requirements go beyond your organization, which means for your vendors also, you need to have some of them.
Yes.
Right? So it's a little tricky phase there. You'll have to be cautious there. Then comes implementing and periodical monitoring. And then once in 6 months or once in a year, you'll have to submit certain audit reports. You will have to make sure that you have those audit reports handy. Just to bring in just an example, right? So that you're aware, right? There are something called as a quarterly compliances. There are certain things called as an annual compliance, right? Now, for example, there is something called as a cyber resilience third-party assessment. Now, for a market institutional investor, beg your pardon, MII, this has to be done once in 6 months. For a qualified RE, this is required annually. For rest of them, this is not required. So this is exactly the complication which I'm talking of, right? And I'll bring you one more just for you to be up with pace, right? Now, doing a overall policy risk management updates review annually applicable across all the 5 categories, right? Whereas I have something called as a privileged user. Rahul, just to give an example, let's say you have access to the application and you are a super admin, right? And your access has to be reviewed on a quarterly basis if you are a MII or qualified RE, whereas you have to review this on a half yearly basis if you fall under the rest of the categories. Now you're able to understand the complication,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Now this is where the approach becomes very important and how you drive it becomes an interesting challenge to solve.
Understood. So we are at 4:40. For next 5 minutes, I'll ask a couple of more questions before we open it up to the audience.
Audience, please go ahead.
So let's move on to something interesting now. So, the framework speaks about Cyber Capability Index, CCI is how we call it. So can you elaborate briefly on this, and
I'll put it in a
why
very
does CCI
short
play a
nutshell
vital role?
so that you get it, right? For the first time, see at the end of the day, everything has to be measured. If what cannot be measured cannot be, monitored. That's a simple framework which all of us are aware, right? It could be starting from our weight and whatever, whatnot. So CCI is a capability index to measure how well the organization's resilient framework is. There are 22 to 23 parameters based on which organizations have to evaluate, and a scoring has to be given. Now, of course, how we have to give the scoring, etc., certain detailed guidelines are there. But in short, this is what is the requirement. And this is applicable only for the top two. Who are the top two?
Okay.
MII, market institutional, market infra institutions, right? And the second one will be qualified registered entities. For the other smaller players, this is not applicable. But yes, it is basically a small framework which will probably help you to enhance it, right? So that's the whole intention. And
So
it'll
it's
give
like
you some
a
sort of,
measurement
optimization.
tool or a marks card for the companies to assess their cybersecurity readiness.
Yes, right. That's typically how it is. And I also want to add one more point, even though you did not specifically mention, I think the next slide is something which I just want to take probably 30 seconds to give you, right? Some of the unique things for the first time they've come up with, right? First is a SOC. I did make a mention. Security Operations Center, for simplicity's sake, it's a real-time monitoring of your infra system, technology, applications, etc. This can be done by your own organization. You could outsource it to a third party, or for the first time, there is an institution called Market SOC, which is basically a SEBI registered, or one of the stock exchanges will be providing this sort of a facility. And the advantage is, if you take up Market SOC, a lot of your requirements are taken care by them. So your compliance, you will say, hey, this is taken care by them. I'm really not bothered, right? Just an FYI. Second, SBOM, I made a mention. It is basically record of the components used in software, details of supply chain relationships. So some of you in the who are veterans in the software industry will realize there were escrow agreements in the past, which ensure that I have the clauses very safe, and tomorrow I have a copy of the source code. But that's a slightly old approach, because even if I give you the code, you literally don't know how to interpret it, right? Rather, if I give you components of the software, the supply chain relationship, who are involved, it is at least easy tomorrow if you have to switch from this fellow to another fellow. Remember the resilience framework, right? The data localization requirement, as I said, this is relaxed. So I'll probably skip that for the time being. VAPT, which is basically doing a penetration testing or a vulnerability assessment. Anytime after a major release, you need to conduct a VAPT. right? That could be a SEBI circular, a core update, new feature which is being added. First time they've introduced API security, right? Which talks about how the limits, the rating, the throttling, the speed at which you need to have, what is the mechanism you're monitoring that. And last, for the newer areas like quantum computing, cryptography, encryption, etc., how are you sort of monitoring, right? So it is giving us slightly a forward driven approach as far as this is concerned.
Thank you. So whenever we have, there is a new regulatory requirement or whenever there is a change in law, it is bound to have some hurdles. And so what do you think are the key challenges and pain points in this framework? And are there any resolutions provided by SEBI?
So I will not say SEBI has given the resolution, rather we will have to figure out what is the way out, right? But I sense a few points when from a challenge perspective, right? The first and foremost is the very fact that it is a uniform cybersecurity and cyber resilience framework. So identifying which grade, where it happens, I think I've already explained that, right? Second, trying to get that sort of a people and tools, right, from a resourcing perspective. Then giving that sort of a risk management, a vendor risk management, real-time threat detection, having a SOC, NOC monitoring, those are going to be challenge. Data management, especially for these new age companies who are having SaaS solutions hosted on Amazon, Google, if the servers are outside of India, you need to be a little concerned. But if as long as it's within India, I don't think you need to be worried too much about it. Implementation timeline, I think I told you Jan versus April. That's obviously that we are crunched with time, and certain maturity factors like your testing, your quality of your software, cyber capability index, etc. So those are obviously going to take much longer than we anticipate. But at this point, with whatever limited implementation assistance I've held out corporates, I think these are few challenges which we are noticing.
So, out of all these things that we are seeing on the screen, what you listed, which do you think the organization should be most careful about, the topmost challenge that might
I
be?
think the first thing is to decide what within the CSCRF is applicable for them. Because the
Okay.
moment they decide what is applicable and not applicable, the rest they can do it, right? If that itself they don't decide, and tomorrow eventually they realize that it is applicable for them, it is a cause of concern. And remember, for the first two, right, which is qualified RE and MII, there is no problem. If you're in the other three, you will
Understood.
evolve over the years, right? You will be probably a self-certified RE. You might come into a small and then move to mid. Now that is going to be a very tricky situation because you felt that so many things are exempt. Then all of a sudden you realize that just because you added that one extra customer on March 31st, or just added an extra 1 crore because let's say March 31st, your stock market went really up. Your entire AUM is up, right? You will have to probably relook into things.
So, step one is the most challenging, you say.
Right.
Okay. Okay, so we'll probably skip the last question since we are at 4:45 now. So thank you, Nara, for patiently answering all the questions. And now we move on to the audience Q&A session. The audience can play detectives now, and let us see if our expert Nara can be the Sherlock Holmes of cybersecurity. So the floor is open now for questions. Please feel free to ask your queries, and let's make it an interactive discussion.
So there's a small window called Q&A. I think you can post your questions there for those of you who have.
Yes. So there is a question. Does a qualified RE require a full-time CISO or can we use a VCISO?
I think they will require a full-time CISO because of the requirements asking us to define them.
Okay. And the
And
next
more importantly, is
question.
the CISO function, which they say, right? Because they say a designated officer shall be appointed. That's one of the requirement of the standard.
Okay. What steps can smaller regulated entities take to achieve compliance with the framework given their resource constraints?
Absolutely agree. This is going to be a challenge. I think the first and foremost is we need to have mapping of those requirements, and as much as possible, see if you are able to use market SOC because they will take care of some of your questions or some of your challenges. So I think that should help you out. And second would be very important. See if you're able to get help from professionals, at least to do that mapping. Or I mean, I'm sure if you are also able to do that, that will be lovely because that mapping will decide what is applicable to you and what is not applicable for you, right? Just that you might become a slightly overwhelmed trying to understand that 200 odd page document, but I think we have to look into it.
And next question from Moshin Raza. Can we have a virtual CISO?
Good question. In fact, I'm getting a lot of questions on these virtual CISO, and I just thought I'll read the framework for you for a reference, right? It goes like this. One of the objectives called GV, which is relating to governance, right? And they have something called as a standard. It says a CISO slash designated officer shall be appointed and report to designated authority in the organization. Now, this is going to be a little tricky. Whether a virtual CISO can do that role, is it sufficient enough? If they've given the powers and they've given the flexibility for them to do it, I think I'm absolutely fine. So I think more than the title of virtual, full-time, part-time, I think it's question of how effective that role is and are you able to do that. I think that's how I will be probably looking into it.
Aditya Jain is asking, since quantum computing is poised to break encryption, even the best ones, how are the organizations supposed to future-proof their cybersecurity measures?
So the only way I can think of, Aditya, is can we use the same set of quantum computing to secure mine, right? So on one side, I'm using it to probably penetrate my system, right? Break an RSA algorithm or an SHA 256 algorithm. Can I use to create dynamic keys, which will change on periodical intervals and frequencies so that, my even if my quantum is trying to break into it, by the time my keys are actually changed, right? Or I'm able to have that sort of a refresh, which is possible, right? So that's one of the initiatives, but I think we have a long way ahead from a quantum perspective. Glad that you're already future ready, but yes, I think that's one of the ways we can look into it.
The next question, how does the framework address the security challenges caused by remote working and cloud computing?
Okay, very good question, especially from a cloud perspective today. I think eventually everybody are within the cloud, right? Now, under each of those domains, it asks us to identify which are the cloud assets we have and how we have access and how we are able to monitor that, right? Now, your cloud asset could also be your email, right? But the question is, email, probably the finance team is just dealing with a different type of requirements versus a customer service team versus some other team. So you need to be very, very clearly understanding the risk, and that's where your risk management becomes very critical, right? So understanding cloud, your risk, and whom access has been given and how you're trying to follow is something which they are considering. One popular method which is people follow and which is also mentioned in the framework is a concept called as zero trust model. In a simple language, zero trust is every time I'm asking you to do something, I'm asking you to double check whether you are the intended person or not. Because in the digital world, you might be the actual person. For a few seconds, somebody takes control of your system. You might not be the actual person who is actually having the access, but you might probably be a perpetrator or a hacker in your place. So zero trust, what it does is at every stage, it tries to validate whether you are as an individual or as a device or any resource, whether it is an organization resource or not, right? So that is one of the methods which has been used. And of course, when you're using remote working, I think you need to have all of your framework relating to your VPNs, restricted connectivity, and see only to what extent we want the connections.
And Siddesh is asking, what are some of the challenges organizations face when? So that I think is already
I think we
answered.
addressed it. That
Yes,
one
yes,
slide
yes,
gave us the answers there.
yes. And how is the cyber security, not the regulation per se, relevant to SMEs which are not coming under the regulation?
Interesting question. So the way I look at this entire ambit is, right. One side, regulatory is trying to come up with as much as requirements from RBI, SEBI, IRDA, Provident Fund, Pension Authority, etc. Right. That's where the regulated space is. Now, very soon you will find the Data Privacy Act and the law, including the rules being notified. Of course, the draft rules are available for public comments. I'm happy to have another webinar on some other day on this particular topic. But yes, that is also something which is there in the system as such. Now, given that these rules are going to become, the data privacy rules are going to applicable for every organization which is processing personal data, invariably some elements of cybersecurity measures, safeguarding measures, you have to start, right? And to me, that becomes one single point where SMEs will have to now seriously start rethinking on cybersecurity. Because privacy, you can have the best of the personal information in your system, right? But if your security from a cyber security angle is not very secure, it will moat, right? And it will go to unauthorized users. So therefore, I think eventually with all of these frameworks and regulations coming into picture, we will have something more actually increasing. But having said that, from a Companies Act standpoint, yes, there are requirements of internal financial controls, IT general control testing, etc. The non-company SMEs may probably will have to start becoming more robust. Like for example, if you recollect, Rahul, ICA came up with a framework on what is that for non-corporates, a financial reporting framework,
Yes,
right?
yes, yeah. For
So
the
and that is
partnership
applicable, I
firms
think, from
and
next year.
proprietorship and stuff.
Yes. So similarly, I'm sure some frameworks like this will mature and it will start coming in. If not now, it will probably a question of a couple of years.
Understood. And next is an interesting question. How long will it take to make ourselves quantum crypto immune?
Good question, Chandan Krishna. I have no answer for it. Let me be very honest, right? The world of crypto is evolving. The world of quantum is also evolving. People say that, the first quantum computers, probably there's a domination between IBM and maybe Microsoft or Google's of the world. But where are we going to head in? Maybe 5 to 10 years, it would still take to mature. Today, the entire world is focused on the AI era. So probably they're catching up the AI race. And maybe this is not too far behind. We will get some more updates.
How does the framework address the increasing risk associated with emerging technologies like AI
Good
and
question.
blockchain?
Good question. See, as a framework, right, it is not something which is specific on saying how you have to address artificial intelligence, how you need to do. And that is where, see, today the risk is on AI and blockchain, maybe. Tomorrow, the risk could be, as somebody said, on a quantum. So the risk will keep on evolving. But what you need to have is the risk management function, and is the function capable enough of identifying these new risks? To give an example, Rahul, I'm sure when we do audits or as a matter of any of the conversations, we always have in the back of our mind to ask something which is the latest trend to ask as a conversation, right? A simple example today is in interview questions, people are asking, do you know how to use AI? Right? Because, and frankly speaking, even for a articleship or a CA or even an entry level data entry job, this becomes a question which is necessary because it's a skill set which is needed. When you're asking a question on, do you know how to use AI? The question is, does your organization have a risk assessment of AI? Right? And that is where the risk assessment becomes very critical. The entire freedom is given to the organization as to how you want to define your risk framework, but make it as comprehensive as possible.
Understood. I'm mindful of time. I think we have 5 minutes left. So I'll take a couple of more questions before we conclude the session.
Sure. I mean, if
Is the term
there are a few
AUM
questions, we can go
defined?
ahead.
Does it mean, sorry?
If there are a few questions, we can go ahead. I'm okay with it.
Yeah. So is the term AUM defined? Does it mean committed capital called or FMV?
No, I think
Framework
it's
control.
see again, this AUM is applicable only for AIF categories, if you remember. And AIF registration itself based on AUM, no? How much asset is asset under management. Basically, the
Mhm.
market value of all your assets which you are managing, that becomes your asset under management. Like mutual funds have this concept of AUM. Collective investment schemes may have this concept. So, that's where the AUM comes into picture.
So on what basis can we prepare a checklist for the CSCRF audit? There is a part one standard and a part two
Good
guideline.
question. Good question. Thanks for asking this. See, the way the structure is, there are four parts. The first part is all about objectives and standards, right? What do you intend to achieve? In order to meet that first part, the guidelines are given in second part. As simple as that, right? So, for example, if an objective and a standard is applicable, how to enforce that is given in guidelines, right? For example, I
Understood.
said, no, you need to have a governance function will be given in objective and standard. You need to have a risk management function will be given. What should be the guidelines? If you recollect, I said, consider all risk, including emerging technology. That would have been mentioned in the guidelines. I hope you're able to get that, right? So
Yes.
objective and standard first will decide for whom all it is applicable. Then the guidelines will give you the detailed steps, which also talks about mandatory, suggested, etc., which the REs will have to follow. Then section 3 and section 4 is all about format of reporting. If you remember, I told you the first time the framework also says what is the format of reporting, how you need to inform, all of those. And section 4 talks about, additional resources, references, and things like
And Is ISO 27001 applicable for mid-size REs? If not, then what are the standards?
So the way it is written is ISO 27001 is mandatory for the first three uh, uh, MII. Then you have your what is this QRE and for mid-size RE.
And
And
what
in fact,
role does third party?
I'll read that paragraph just for a reference. It says, in fact, they use the word ISO audit and certification. It is mandated that MII and qualified RE shall obtain ISO. Accordingly, all MII and qualified shall obtain within 1 year, and they shall issue the report. And they've also given certain cases where you need to additionally follow that. For the mid-size, they've given that sort of a liberty. I stand corrected there. For the mid-size, they've given that liberty. But having said that, eventually, I think that's a good framework for you to adhere to.
The next question, what does third party risk management play in the framework, and how can companies ensure compliance from their vendors? This is a challenge that,
Now, let us be very honest that today, without vendors, we as an organization cannot exist. And there are so many things that the vendor is helping us. Many times, our data is going to the vendor system, and from there, we are getting it back. Right? So imagine if a vendor system fails, a vendor will not be held liable, you will be held accountable because you are the primary registrant or you are the person primary for whom regulation is applicable. So the only thing which you can do is make sure all the parties, in fact, this is called as third party and fourth party management, where your organization downstream supply chain are having sufficient regulatory measures, or sorry, beg your pardon, more than regulatory measures is technical measures to monitor the overall risk. I have seen certain cases where the entire cybersecurity framework has given to, with some questions have been given to the vendors. The vendors have been asked to provide evidence and prove that they are compliant. Some cases they have said, they've told that I will deal only with ISO 27001 compliant vendors to make sure that I don't have any challenges. So like these certain things are definitely coming up in the space.
I'll take one last question. Uh, does the person designated as a CISO require any qualification?
Nothing as such. But he should be aware of what the cyber world talks of, right? So I cannot get an accountant and I can make him a CISO just for the sake of compliance. I would rather prefer somebody who has got some understanding of risk and technology.
Thank you, Ganara, once again for patiently answering all the questions from our audience. As we come to the end of the webinar, can request Nara to probably summarize and give his closing remark, probably 30 seconds.
Sure. Thanks. I think, this is first of all a very interesting framework which has come up. And never in the history of India did we have such a robust cybersecurity framework. Let's be very, very honest, right? It is obviously going to be a challenge. It is definitely going to be a challenge. And some of the things are going to evolve. It is going to be probably some sort of a non-compliance for a short period. But as long as you are able to showcase that you are compliant and you're going ahead, I think you should do that. The second very important thing is start early. Don't let it go towards the last stage and say, hey, okay, fine, I'll probably do an assessment a little later. I'm afraid that may not give you the required justice. So start early. Do those sort of assessments, whatever it may be, whether you're doing it by yourself, through professionals like us, I leave that to you, right? But start early because many times you realize that there could be some bottlenecks, right? There could be some non-compliance, other things, right? And figure out how you have to implement certain tools to automate some of them because it is impossible that you manually track each and every requirement, right? So that's where we will evolve, and that's where I see how the world is going to mature around this cybersecurity framework. So on that note, I think we all are professionals. We'll keep on learning more. I'll be happy to share more as we come on, get along and get some more insights.
Thank you once again to our esteemed speaker for sharing such an invaluable insight, and also the audience for their active participation. We had so many questions within the limited time available. I could get some of them. We'll continue to host the InTalks webinar on various other topics as well. So please stay connected on our LinkedIn page, the website, and other platforms. If you have any further questions or clarifications on this topic, you can always reach out to us on email or call. We'll be more than happy to assist you. Thank you once again for joining us, and I hope you found this session valuable. Let's continue to have these conversations among our colleagues, organizations, communities, and stay vigilant, stay resilient, and have a wonderful day. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. See you. Bye.